Starring some exceptionally rare classic jets and around 30 piston warbirds in the flying display, plus some top-quality military performances, Air Legend in France has doubtless become one of the world's very best air shows.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Airshow Dispatches, and this time I'm recording this from the top of the control tower at Moulins Villaroche Airfield in France. We've just finished day one of Air Legend 2023, and what an incredible show it has been. This is one of the greatest air shows in the world in my opinion, and down on the ramp below me we've got over 30 piston engine warbirds, more than 10 vintage jets, and quite a large lineup of modern military aircraft as well. Now, French air shows have gone through a tricky time in the last few years. Some new rules came into force that made it rather difficult to pull off those one-off set-piece displays that make air shows in France so exciting. I'm pleased to say that the organisers here have been learning to work with those new rules, and this year's show is very much a return to form with some wonderful formations and set pieces which we're bringing to you over the course of this episode. Let's take a look at the lineup and running order.
We start with an exceptional performance by 6 French Navy aircraft, old and new, including their fabulous Rafale tactical display, then an assortment of other military and civilian types. At around the 20-minute mark, we start our chronological journey through aviation history, taking us from the Battle of France through to the latter years of the Second World War, with a very rare French airshow appearance by B-17 Salis B. Towards the end of the show, the vintage jets, and finally the ambassadors of the French Air and Space Force. Taxiing out now our first flying display participants, a trio of Rafale Marines, a Zephyr and Paris. They'll be joining an E-2C Hawkeye, which is already in the hold, and they'll start their display with a formation flypast. It's the turn of the classic jets first of all. In the lead, the MS-760 Paris. The Paris traces its roots back to 1953, and the MS-755 Fleuret, a prototype 2-seat jet training aircraft intended for use with the French and Indian Air Forces. Neither air arm opted to order the Fleuret, so Morane-Saulnier set about modifying it into a 4-seat liaison aeroplane. It first flew in 1954 and entered service with the French Air Force and Navy 5 years later. It was also used by Brazil and Argentina. A small number was sold onto the civilian market, making the Paris arguably the world's first private jet. Following behind it, a Fugger CM-175 Zephyr. That's the carrier-capable version of the CM-170 Magister jet trainer, and we'll be seeing a formation of Magisters later in the programme. Only 32 Zephyrs were built, entering service in 1959 and retiring in the 1990s. Now, a very rare airshow appearance indeed by one of the French Navy's E-2C Hawkeyes. The French Navy has operated the Hawkeye since the year 2000. They have just 3 of them, of which 2 are based aboard the Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, leaving 1 airframe available for training sorties and, occasionally, air shows. Those 3 E-2Cs are soon to be replaced by more modern E-2Ds, which include new radars, radios, computers and engines. The most significant single upgrade is probably the addition of active electronically scanned array radar. France is the only nation other than the USA to operate the Hawkeye from aircraft carriers. Both the French and American navies practice a high degree of interoperability, and that has even extended to operating their Hawkeyes from each other's ships in the past. Now, another pass from the 3 Rafales to demonstrate buddy-buddy refuelling, the lead aircraft carrying a centerline fuel tank equipped with a hose and drogue system. And 2 of the Rafales will now break away for a tactical display of the highest quality. A phenomenally tightly choreographed and absolutely relentless performance that includes close formation flying, tail chasing, opposition manoeuvres and more. Like the Hawkeye, the French Navy has also operated its Rafales from American carriers. In fact, the Rafale is the only foreign-designed fighter aircraft permitted to do so. The Rafale Marine was the first variant of the Rafale to enter service. It did so in 2001, 5 years before the Air Force received their first examples. Their first combat deployment followed a year later as part of Operation Enduring Freedom, but the aircraft's weapon systems at that time didn't include any air-to-ground capability, so the type didn't actually see any action. It was 2 years later, in 2004, that the Rafale M was finally declared fully operational, and in 2016 the type was used in active combat for the first time. In from the right, the Rafale Marines for their final pass. But But that's not quite all from the French Navy. We also enjoyed a 3-ship display by the Condor's Acier aerobatic team flying 3 Cap-10Ms. The French Navy has 5 Cap-10s, and they are used for the evaluation, selection and basic training of French Navy fighter pilots. These aircraft have been in service since the early 1980s, but they are soon to be bolstered by the delivery of 2 new Cap-10NGs, which will allow the French Navy to meet its target of training 45 cadets each year. After the delivery of the Cap-10NGs, the older Cap-10Ms will all receive a substantial upgrade, not least with the fitting of a next-generation glass cockpit. The Cap-10 is a very popular aerobatic machine. I've often heard it said that you can have as much fun in a Cap-10 as in an early Mark Spitfire. It's also used by a small number of armed forces, France, Mexico and Australia for example, and it spawned some truly world-leading competition aerobatic machines, namely the Cap-20 and later the Cap-232. Next up, our first piston warbirds of the day. It's a C47 and 2 C45s from the classic formation team. This display was a tribute to Air Legend's long-standing commentator Bernard Chabert, and for a moment, we'll dip into the live event commentary to hear the tribute to him.
La voix historique de ce meeting aérien. Et justement, l'amour du vol, c'est lui qui en parlait si bien.
Non, on vole parce qu'en volant, on s'élève, déjà. Ensuite, parce que regardez toutes les religions, toutes les croyances, il n'y en a pas qui placent le paradis, le bonheur absolu et ineffable, qui placent ça ailleurs que là-haut, au ciel. Personne ne rêve d'aller finir. Encore une fois, toutes les croyances, peu importe les modalités par chaque croyance, toutes les croyances placent la sérénité, ce qu'on recherche tous finalement, d'une manière ou d'une autre, on le place là-haut. Donc voler, c'est se payer un acompte de paradis.
Alors pour lui rendre hommage, s'il vous plaît, je voudrais un tonnerre d'applaudissements pour un homme qui a tant fait pour nous, Monsieur Bernard Chabert.
He was a journalist, a presenter, a pilot with more than 250 types in his logbook, and the preeminent airshow commentator for pretty well all the largest airshows in France, plus several more in the UK and Switzerland. He died in December 2022 at the age of 78. Our next few displays don't come from regular airshow participants. Here we have a couple of flypasts by a Dyer TBM 940 from the Flight Test Department of the DGA. That's the organisation responsible for French military procurements. Designed and built in France, the TBM is the world's fastest single-engine passenger-carrying aircraft, with a cruise speed and range that matches light business jets. The DGA use the aircraft as chase planes and liaison platforms, with a fleet of 4 TBM 940s entering service in 2021. Here, an EC-145 from the Gendarmerie, the French military police, responsible for the country's internal security. The Gendarmerie has 15 EC-145s, which are equipped with a hoist, searchlight and military-grade radios. In this display we see that hoist being put to good use, lowering a sniffer dog and its handler in a simulated search and rescue mission. An even larger fleet of EC-145s is also operated in a similar role by the French Civil Security Forces. Our final rotary asset of the day here, and it's a very sprightly display indeed from this EC-120 operated by civilian company Helidax on behalf of the French Army. Helidax has a fleet of 36 EC-120s used for basic rotary wing training by the French Air Force, Army, Navy and Gendarmerie. The type was designed as the successor to the Gazelle, with most of the work done in France, but this was a multinational cooperation which also involved Singaporean aerospace company ST Aero and Chinese company CATIC. Air Legend is primarily a warbird show, and we will get to the chronological story very shortly. But first, one more military performance. It's the 2 Rafale Bs of Requin Mike.
Le passage à l'anglaise de la 4e escadre de chasse de Saint-Dizier.
Requin Mike from the 4th Fighter Squadron is the only unit providing the French Air and Space Forces Rafale tactical display this year. It's a part-time unofficial team scheduled to perform at just 4 air shows all season, with Air Legend being the first of them. They fly the Rafale B, the 2-seat land-based version of the Rafale. The Raphael B was designed originally as a conversion trainer for the single-seat Rafale C, but it's actually ended up being used as a combat aircraft in its own right. This sees the aircraft operated in a similar style to the F-15E, with the second seat being occupied not by an instructor, but by a weapons systems operator. The French Air Force received its first Rafales in 2006, and they made their combat debut the following year in support of Dutch troops in Afghanistan. Since then, Rafales have been used in combat almost continuously, flying missions over Iraq, Libya, Syria and Mali. The Rafale's export success has been bolstered significantly over the last couple of years. India, Qatar and Egypt have operated the type for some time. Greece received their first Rafales in 2021, while Croatia, Indonesia and the UAE are awaiting their first deliveries. Indeed, the first Croatian jets will be delivered in the coming weeks. We commence now the main warbird segment, and first up, our sole representative of the Battle of France, a D3801. That's one of the Swiss licence-built versions of the Marine 406, which was France's most numerous fighter during the Second World War. The MS-406 found itself outperformed and outgunned by German aircraft like the Bf-109. They had unresponsive guns that tended to jam, and while they handled nicely, their top speed was over 50 knots slower than that of the Messerschmitt. The Swiss-built models like this one were fitted with new engines, propellers and guns, which did improve the aircraft's performance, but they proved to be fairly unreliable, and development was halted as soon as the P47D Mustang became available. Next up, representing the Battle of Britain, a pair of Hawker Hurricanes. In the lead, Hurricane BE-505. Originally ordered as a Mark I, this aircraft flew with the Royal Canadian Air Force in the early 1940s. It was restored to flight in 2009 in Hurry Bomber configuration and painted to represent a Hurricane Mark II-B. A further modification saw the cockpit lengthened to accommodate a second seat and a set of dual controls, making this the only two-seat Hurricane in the world currently flying. Flying in the number 2 position is Hurricane R4118, often said to be the most historic and original Second World War aircraft still surviving in an airworthy condition. Built in 1940, the aircraft served with 605 Squadron during the Battle of Britain, flying 49 sorties and shooting down 5 enemy aircraft. She was later donated to an Indian engineering university for static display before being returned to the UK in 2001. The two aircraft are flown by James Brown and Mike Collett.
Et oui, pour ces avions, vous avez certainement...
Representing the occupation of France, a trio of German aircraft, one Junkers Ju-52 and a pair of MS-505 Criquets, the French post-war version of the Fieseler Storch.
La dualité de ces avions, les petits avions et les grands avions, systématiquement dans le cadre de la Seconde Guerre mondiale, car pour assurer les forces d'occupation, évidemment on avait un besoin en transport de fret, de marchandises et d'hommes. Pour assurer ce transport, on utilisait ce cylindres. Quand vous allez voir le Junker 52 qui va revenir sur votre gauche, vous pourrez voir les cylindres. Et à la différence de beaucoup d'avions, voire presque tous les avions de la Seconde Guerre mondiale dans sa catégorie, le Junker 52 a une particularité unique.
The Storch was a German liaison and observation aircraft used from 1936 until 1945, famous for its exceptionally low stall speed of less than 30 knots. After the war, the French military used a mix of captured Storchs and new-build versions produced by Morane-Saulnier, and they were used operationally during the Indochina War and Algerian War. The French-built examples had new engines and used aluminium rather than wood for the wings. The Junkers 52 is the largest airworthy aircraft operated by the Amical Jean-Baptiste Salis at La Ferté-Alais. The type was used both as a civilian airliner and a military transport aircraft, with manufacturing split between Germany, France and Hungary. Post-war, both France and Spain built their own versions of the U-52, which were used until the 1960s. Unfortunately, the aircraft was involved in a landing accident on the second day of the airshow. A botched approach and go-around was followed by a second landing attempt, during which the aircraft overran the runway. Luckily, no one was injured and the aircraft has since been repaired and has flown back to its base at La Ferté. The next performance comes from Brice Orion in his first year as a solo warbird display pilot. In this case, he's flying his Spitfire Mark 14. This display commemorated the rodeo missions, seek and destroy raids carried out by Spitfires from RAF Hornchurch from 1941 until 1944. These usually consisted of long-range ground attack missions, at least long-range for the Spitfire, flown at extreme low level with an abnormally high chance of being shot down either by German aircraft or air defences. The targets were often boats, trains, vehicles, or small factories and military installations which were too small or moved too fast to be vulnerable to attack by high-altitude heavy bombers. The The D-Day landings were commemorated by an Air Legend regular, the Chalet C47. This particular aircraft, however, did not take part in D-Day. It was built in 1945 and fitted out with a VIP interior, a cabin that it retains to this day, and it was used regularly to transport Queen Elizabeth II. It flew with the US Army Air Force, then the Royal Air Force as a Dakota Mark IV, and finally the Royal Canadian Air Force designated as a CC-129. Her civilian career has seen her move between France and Canada several times, and she's flown as a civilian airliner as recently as the 1980s. Also commemorating D-Day, an L3 Grasshopper and L5 Sentinel retell the role of light liaison aircraft in performing observation missions over Normandy ahead of the advancing Allied troops. These aircraft come from Ham and Jam, an association co-run by Air Legend's event director, Isa Bazin. In fact, one of the aircraft here is flown by her partner, Arnaud.
Alors d'où ça vient le nom Jam? Revenons sur une opération du département de Normandie, l'opération Dead Stick. L'objectif était de prendre le pont de Bénouville.
The unusual name of Ham and Jam comes from Operation Dead Stick, the Allied mission to seize Pegasus Bridge and Ranville Bridge in the aftermath of D-Day. Ham and Jam were the code words used by L-Bird pilots to confirm that the bridges were intact, thus permitting the passage of troops who had landed on the Normandy beaches.
L'enjeu est énorme, alors on a défini des codes radio qui avaient été définis pour annoncer le résultat de l'assaut qui était en cours. Ham pour annoncer que le pont sur le canal se trouvait entre les mains britanniques et qu'il n'était pas détruit, et Jam pour indiquer la même chose pour celui de l'ordre.
The slow and painful liberation of Europe was marked by the participation of B-17G Flying Fortress Sally B, flown by Peter Kuipers, and a Spitfire Mark 5C, flown by Stu Goldspink. This was an emotional moment for French airshow fans. Not all that long ago, there were two airworthy B-17s in Europe, Sally B and Pink Lady, the latter being based at La Ferté-Alais. Pink Lady has sadly been grounded since 2009, and this is the first performance by a B-17 at a French airshow ever since then.
À ce stade, il s'appelle encore le Boeing 299, c'est un prototype et il a volé pour la première
The display required a monumental effort from the Air Legend organising team, who faced several last-minute challenges, not least the requirement to find a suitable customs airport which could provide indefinite hangarage for the B-17 in the unlikely event that it encountered a technical problem during its customs check and was grounded for repairs. The Air Legend team had to work all through the night to solve this and other problems in the run-up to the show, only finding a solution with 2 days to spare. This particular B-17 variant, the G model, was the final mass production version and accounts for 2/3 of B-17s built. Compared to older models, the B-17G had more guns, including 2 facing forwards, and offered a better view from the bomb aimer's position thanks to a redesigned plexiglass dome.
Puissance de feu colossale, et d'ailleurs à l'occasion de ses premiers engagements opérationnels en Europe, la tactique changera. Et oui, on se rendra compte que quand on fait évoluer les bombardiers en Orion, on peut avoir des tas de gunners qui visent dans la même direction. Et oui, on arrive à faire des tirs de suppression depuis les aéronefs. Forcément, pour le chasseur isolé qui essaie de s'attaquer à une formation de bombardiers, la tâche devient plus ardue.
Et on y réfléchit. Il faut savoir que les femmes étaient impliquées à un autre niveau, parce que quand ces gros bombardiers sortaient d'usine, il fallait encore les convoyer jusqu'au dépôt de l'US Army Air Force, dépôt qui ensuite dispatchait vers les unités. Et là encore, les hommes étaient au combat sur le front, alors on a fait appel aux femmes pilotes pour convoyer ces énormes avions, et pas seulement, aussi les chasseurs. Tout ce qui sortait d'usine était en général convoyé jusqu'au dépôt de l'US Army Air Force par des femmes.
The participation of the Spitfire recalls the fact that it was Supermarines fighter that provided initial escort support for American bombers during their daylight raids, and not Mustangs. The Spitfire was not especially well suited to the role, however, and it pushed at the limits of the aircraft's range. It wasn't until mid-1943 that American fighters like the P47 and P51 were modified to extend their range, and that allowed them to slowly take over from the Spitfire over the following year. It was, in time, the Mustang that became most famous for its role escorting B-17s over enemy territory, their range extended by the use of drop tanks under the wings. Here we see a formation sequence led by Stephen Stead in P-51D Little Rebel. Previously flying in the United States, this aircraft arrived at its current base in Belgium in early 2022. Flying in the number 2 position and about to perform an excellent solo display is George Raab in P-51D Francis Dell. This aircraft was built in 1945, but was put straight into storage until 1950 before seeing any military service. It was later used briefly by the Royal Canadian Air Force before being sold onto the civilian market. Francis Dell was brought to Europe in 2020 and is owned by Flying Legend in Germany. There are some fantastic examples of the Mustang's trademark whistle in this sequence, some of the best whistles I've ever heard. There's some debate as to exactly what's causing this.
Un avion, lui, décolle toujours contre le vent.
Le Mustang, il a été un faiseur d'as.
The mainstream theory, and a theory that's been backed up with some rudimentary tests, suggests that it's caused when the air flows over the number 1 gun port when the aircraft is pitching. But there are some Mustangs without gun ports that still produce a similar sound. Another theory is that it's caused by air over the cooling duct. Others say that it's the sound of the supercharger under load. Quite possibly it's a mix of all three factors. The critical but often forgotten Eastern Front was represented by a Yak-3UA, a formidable Soviet fighter that was often thought by its pilots to be equal or superior to the Mustang and Spitfire in the low-level environment. Its effect on the Luftwaffe was no less devastating either. On one mission shortly after D-Day, 18 Yak-3s clashed with 24 German fighters and shot down 15 of them, with only one loss of their own.
Cet avion, normalement, il est réservé pour les pilotes chevronnés parce que, comme tu le soulignes, il n'est pas si simple que ça.
In fact, it was such a potent fighter that Luftwaffe activity in areas where Yak-3s prowled was hugely scaled back, and German pilots were warned to avoid engaging them. The war in the Pacific was marked by another Air Legend regular, the PBY-5A Catalina. If you want to find out more about this aircraft, then do check out our bonus film from Air Legend 2022, when I got to ride on board this aeroplane for the transit flight over to France.
Quand vous le regardez alors qu'il arrive vers nous, si on le coupe en deux, on peut se dire que le bas de cet avion, c'est un bateau, et le haut de cet avion, eh ben, c'est un avion. Ça en fait un hydravion absolument parfait, et à l'intérieur duquel on a quand même pas mal de place. Avec...
And then 3 more aircraft from that theatre, coming from the Flying Bulls. Some very photogenic 3-ship passes to open the display, led by the B-25J Mitchell and flanked by the P-38L Lightning and F4U-4 Corsair. Frederick Handelman is the captain of the B-25, an aircraft used across Europe, North America and the Pacific, but also remaining in service post-war well into the 1970s. Bomb load of 1.3 tons, half that of the B-17 we saw earlier, but the B-25 was considerably more versatile. It was able to take off from aircraft carriers, for example, not least during the Doolittle raids. And then the turn of the fighters, the Corsair flown by Eric Goujon and the Lightning by Raymond Reidman. Able to fly higher and faster than any other aircraft of its era, the P-38 was not only a superlative fighter, but also an extremely capable photo reconnaissance platform. In fact, 90% of aerial imagery captured over Europe by the Allies came from P-38s. The Corsair was another exceptional fighter. It boasted the highest kill ratio of any Allied fighter of the Second World War at 11-1. Partly, though, it must be said, because much of its action was up against untrained Japanese kamikaze pilots who did present easy targets. Only 189 Corsairs were lost in air-to-air combat, despite the type claiming more than 2,000 air-to-air kills. But it was difficult to fly, and it had an appalling safety record. Over 1,000 Corsairs were destroyed in non-combat accidents. Now the Flying Bull's Corsair joins up with a second F4U, this time from the Amical Jean-Baptiste Salis and flown by Edmund Salis. This formation pays tribute to the son of the late Jean-Baptiste Salis, Jean Salis, who passed away on the 2nd of June this year, just a few days after the 50th anniversary edition of the Airshow he founded at La Ferté-Alais. More great American fighters now, and this time it's a two-ship display featuring France flying legends P-40N Warhawk, based here at Moulins, and a TF-51D Mustang. This is the public debut of this TF-51, which goes by the name of Miss Ava. It made its first post-restoration flight from Sywell in the UK in August of this year, and moved to its new home of La Ferté-Alais on the 6th of September, just 3 days prior to the start of Air Legend. That meant there wasn't much time to practice this two-ship formation display, which was, it must be said, a little on the high side. Its pilots instead used a pair of Pitts Specials for the display practices. A pair of aircraft based full-time at Sywell now, First up, Mark Levy in Europe's sole airworthy P47 Thunderbolt. It's amazing to think that the P47 was originally conceived as a lightweight fighter, because what resulted was the largest and heaviest single-engine piston fighter in history.
Et oui, le P47 Thunderbolt est l'un des principaux chasseurs américains de la Seconde Guerre mondiale et il excellera dans la mission d'escorte de bombardiers.
The aircraft was quite literally designed around its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine. The P47 was originally intended to serve as an escort fighter, but it turned out that the aircraft excelled in the ground attack role.
Il est un petit peu moins manœuvrant que le Spitfire, mais c'est pas très grave parce que quand on va l'utiliser, on va faire de l'attaque en piqué. Et pour lui qui a un pilotage extrêmement agressif, prendre une vitesse colossale en piqué, évidemment l'avion n'est pas très aérodynamique, mais comme il est lourd et qu'il est puissant, quand il va mettre le nez vers le sol, il va prendre une vitesse absolument effrayante pour les ennemis. Et finalement, le P47 allait totalement...
This particular aircraft flew in US service as a trainer in the mid-1940s before moving to the Peruvian Air Force. He then embarked on a civilian career that encompassed both the UK and the United States.
Déjà présent aux États-Unis, pourquoi avoir choisi ce chasseur, tout comme pour les bombardiers? On a besoin de deux chasseurs.
Another aircraft from fighter aviation engineering, here's Alex Smee in the Fury ISS. Iraq operated the only non-navalised version of the Fury, known as the Iraqi single seat. They were used in multiple conflicts, including the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, but they had fairly limited utility in practice because while Britain was happy to export the aircraft itself, they didn't provide sufficient ammunition to allow the Iraqi Air Force to employ the Fury effectively.
Émis par un pays. Pourquoi? Car les pays sont souvent les seuls à pouvoir se permettre d'acheter des avions de guerre. Et donc pour que les industriels aient envie de développer des avions, il faut bien leur donner une carotte, si je veux dire. Il faut bien leur donner un objectif. L'objectif, vous l'avez compris, c'est des contrats de près de 1000 machines à chaque fois.
Today, the aircraft is painted as a prototype Fury Mark II. That was a stepping stone between the original Fury Mark I, which was never put into mass production, and the navalised Sea Fury as used by the Fleet Air Arm. Hence, it's been fitted with a tail hook, but it doesn't have folding wings like a true Sea Fury. This was perhaps the centrepiece of Air Legend 2023, a fantastic 40-minute classic jet display featuring a replica Me-262, MiG-15 and Sabre. This formation tells the story of early jet development and specifically the influence of the Me-262's swept wings on post-war jet design. the Me-262 splits off. We'll see more of that later, but the Sabre and MiG remain together for a Korean War reenactment. Not just a gentle tail chase as we usually see in so-called combat reenactments, but a genuinely dynamic, fully aerobatic dogfight. Initially, the MiG-15 held the advantage over the Sabre. It could climb faster and turn tighter, not least because without an ejection seat it was extremely lightweight. It also had far better high-altitude performance and could cruise at heights that the Sabre couldn't even reach. But as time went by, the balance began to shift as newer, more powerful variants of the Sabre came along. To combat this, MiG pilots employed some interesting tactics, often flying in huge stepped-down formations that provided mutual fire cover, thus projecting an overwhelming force that even more advanced American jets would avoid dealing with. The MiG's mission was not necessarily to shoot the American jets down, but to throw them off course and cause them to abandon their missions. And in that role, the large MiG formations were very often successful. More from them later, but back to the Me-262 now, a scale replica representing the very first operational jet fighter. Its swept wings, set at 18.5 degrees, were implemented not to elicit any improvement in performance, but rather to adjust the aircraft's centre of gravity. But in adding that sweep, Messerschmitt's engineers stumbled upon a design trait that would prove decisive in the development of jet-powered aircraft, and one which early British and American jets had not taken into account. Compared to the Meteor, the Me-262 was better armed, more fuel efficient, and 150 knots faster. Having said that, the 262 was a much harder aircraft to maintain. Its engines needed a major overhaul every 20 flight hours, and it's often said that for every Me-262 that was flying, there were 5 more undergoing heavy maintenance on the ground. Here's Europe's only airworthy single-seat MiG-15, well, technically a Polish-built Lim 2. It's one of 2 MiG-15s operated by the Squadron Foundation, and they hope to soon add a MiG-17 and MiG-21 to their collection as well. And now Frederick Ackery in his Sabre Mark 6. This is the ultimate version of the Sabre, built under licence in Canada. And I must say, it was amazing to spend some time talking to Fred shortly before the show and to hear his enthusiasm for this aircraft. He is absolutely convinced of the fact that this is the best handling fighter that any civilian can reasonably own today. I was also astonished to learn that Fred does all of the engineering and maintenance work on this aircraft himself. He has no support team around him save for his social media specialist. Perhaps unusually for a vintage jet pilot, Fred comes from an aerobatic background rather than being an airline pilot or coming from the military. That means he has designed a very complex photogenic routine that is all about entertainment, with a particular emphasis on snappy aileron rolls with impeccably precise roll starts and stops. From the Korean War to the Vietnam War, and here is a pair of AD-4N Sky Raider and OV-10B Bronco. The Bronco project was launched in 1963. The requirement was for an armed reconnaissance aircraft for the US Marine Corps, but as the Air Force and Navy joined the program, the focus shifted to a more offensive platform capable of carrying out counterinsurgency. This aircraft is an OV-10B, a specialised unarmed target tug model developed for West Germany.
Un avion léger de reconnaissance et d'attaque au sol. Vous voyez, l'avion a une forme absolument atypique à la différence du A4 Skyrider dont on connaît parfaitement. D'une part, il a la forme de tous les chasseurs de l'assaut.
However, it's been mocked up as an OV-10A combat variant with clamshell doors at the rear rather than an observation dome and stub wings under the fuselage. The Sky Raider was first used during the Korean War, where its weapons payload and 10-hour mission endurance far outclassed the early jets. And come the start of the Vietnam War, the Sky Raider was still the primary medium attack aircraft for US forces. Although not designed as a fighter, the Sky Raider was armed with a cannon and successfully claimed 2 air-to-air kills against much faster and more manoeuvrable MiG-17s. That concludes the historic portion of our programme, and before we start our showcase of modern French Air and Space Force assets, here's a trio of L-39C Albatrosses from Patrouille Fly and Fun. The L-39 was designed in the late 1960s as the primary jet trainer for the Warsaw Pact. It's still very much in service with more than 30 nations, who operate the type either as a trainer or as a light attack platform. It's also still in development. The L39NG first flew just 5 years ago, intended to replace those older models of L39, but truth be told, it's seen very modest sales success so far. It's also been developed into a dedicated combat version, the L159 Alka, which is employed by the Czech Air Force. In from the left and right for an opposition pass, and a good view of the tip tanks fitted to these aircraft, which include high-intensity landing lights. Those tip tanks can be removed and replaced by fin-shaped wingtips, which increase the effective wingspan by 9%, improving efficiency and turn performance. In fact, the reduction in drag almost completely makes up for the reduction in fuel capacity, meaning that L39s without tip tanks actually have almost the same range as L39s with tip tanks. Strange but true. And now pulling up on the B-axis for the final split. Now, from Transport Squadron 161 of the French Air and Space Force, the A400M tactical display. Coming up, a very impressive wing rock demonstrating 60 degrees angle of bank. The A400M is the French Air and Space Force's largest transport aircraft with a payload of 37 tons. It's also their second most numerous. It is a strategic airlifter with roughly double the capacity of the C-130, but it also has some impressive tactical airlift capability, including best-in-class stall performance and the ability to operate from austere runways. Another big wing rock, this time at very low speed with flaps and gear extended. And now a missed approach demonstrating the power of its 8-bladed Europrop TP400 engines, producing a combined 44,000 shaft horsepower. That's more than double the power available to the Allison T56 powered C130H Hercules, which France also operates. And as we draw towards the end of the flying programme, it's time for the inimitable Patrouille de France. A crowd rear arrival there, something that's not permitted during public airshow days, as French airshow regulations don't allow crowd overflights of any kind, but the PAF have made a habit of arriving from crowd rear during their display rehearsals. Then they pull up into 2 consecutive loops, the first in Très Grande Flèche and then collapsing into Apollo formation. This year marks the 70th anniversary of the Patrouille de France, but that's the 70th anniversary with an asterisk, so join me in Pedantry Corner, why don't you, as we explain the exact circumstances surrounding this anniversary. You see, the name Patrouille de France was first used informally in 1952 to describe a 4-ship team of F-84 Thunderjets. That identity was officially adopted by the French Air Force to describe that team in 1953, 70 years ago, and that is what the anniversary celebrates. In the 1950s and 60s, the Patrouille de France brand was passed around 4 different French Air Force squadrons, which all took it in turns to carry the baton. Eventually, in 1964, the Patrouille de France brand was transferred to the aerobatic team of the French Air Force's Flight Academy at Salon de Provence, and that is the unit that still bears the Patrouille de France name to this day. But this unit is far more than 70 years old. In fact, the Academy has been performing aerobatic displays almost continuously since 1931, stopping only for the Second World War. So actually, the team you are watching now is not 70 years old, but 92 years old. Officially though, this is the 70th anniversary of the Patrouille de France, let's not argue too hard, and that milestone is about to be celebrated in an absolutely jaw-dropping manoeuvre. The manoeuvre you are seeing now has been developed for 1 season only and is simply called Heritage. The PAF has used the Alpha Jet since 1981, and it's a simply wonderful aircraft for formation aerobatics. Look closely as the aircraft approach head-on and you can see the anhedral in the wings. They're actually sloping slightly downwards. And there's the result of that anhedral: extreme instability on the roll axis. As a result, the roll rate is so fast, and the Patrouille de France makes such extensive use of it that, undeniably, if you take a freeze frame of the performance, there are lots of moments where not everyone is quite in sync. But that's a trade-off worth making in my book, because these rapid rolls are so exciting to watch. And now, following that dramatic break, which was known as the Big Bang, 2 aircraft set up to either side of us for the first of the opposition passes. But from this point on, the display format is slightly different to usual. A typical Patrouille de France display sees the team divided into two groups of four, the box avant and the box arrière. This year they've split into a group of two and a group of six. That has enabled some traditional four-ship manoeuvres to be given a new twist. This one has been given a twist literally. It's called Le Shérif. A classic Patrouille de France manoeuvre, and technically so impressive, but now with two extra aircraft barrel rolling around the formation as well. There are some aerobatic teams in the world, naming no names, who think that a knife-edge pass is a worthy manoeuvre in its own right. Well, that was a double knife-edge pass in a tight four-ship formation with simultaneous Apache rolls to boot. Absolutely unparalleled. Another interesting fact about the PAF compared to, say, the Red Arrows, we see the Reds a lot on airshow dispatches, and their aircraft are each capable of producing three smoke colours, red, white and blue. The Patrouille de France's jets can only produce two colours. They all do white. Half of the team smoke red and the other half smoke blue. Now this is a very unusual formation from which to perform a vertical break, but the Patrouille de France, of course, thrive on being unusual. And now a final opposition pass by the Solos. This is perhaps my favourite manoeuvre of the 2023 sequence. Well, really, it's three manoeuvres in one. First up, the team approach show centre for some Apache rolls in echelon formation, then get ready for a beautiful roll under break. And they're not done quite yet. Twinkle rolls for one extra flourish on the way out. More Apache rolls, but this time while barrel rolling around the lead solo as he performs a negative G outside turn. And another classic Patrouille de France manoeuvre that's been expanded from the traditional 4 aircraft to 6 this year. A rapid formation change from echelon to delta. All back together now for the final break, concluding an absolutely electrifying display. So much to enjoy, objectively, but also technically.
La vitesse est de 700 km/h, le leader est absolument crispé sur son manche de sa manette de gaz. Il tire, facteur de charge, 4G, on arrive en sommet, regarde vers le sol, on a bien...
But our collective Patrouille de France fever has not yet subsided, because in a further nod to the team's 70th anniversary, here are the 4 Fougueux Magisters of Patrouille Tranchant. The Magister was the aircraft operated by the Air Academy's aerobatic team at the point when it took over the Patrouille de France's brand. At that point, they flew 6 of them, although they did subsequently grow to as many as 11 jets at one point, larger than any jet aerobatic team in the world today. Patrouille Tranchant don't have quite that many. They have 5 Magisters, but unfortunately one was in deep maintenance during Air Legend and so was not available to take part in the show. It's an interesting aircraft type. It first flew in 1952, nearly 1,000 of them were built, with licensed production taking place in Israel, Germany and Finland. They served with 21 air forces, and that includes flying for a number of national aerobatic teams, including Ireland's Silver Swallows, Belgium's Red Devils and the Israel aerobatic team.
Pilote émérite, ancien pilote de la Patrouille de France sur laquelle il volait en Fougueux Magister. Il est ravi de tourner autour de cette formation pour vous montrer les capacités de cet avion qu'il affectionne tant.
It was a truly balletic performance and one of my personal highlights of the show. I just love the Fougueux Magister and I think it's one of the prettiest aircraft ever designed. So to see 4 of them performing such graceful formation aerobatics was a real treat.
Mesdames et messieurs, c'est la Patrouille Tranchant. D'avoir été présent aujourd'hui à Melun pour vous présenter cette patrouille d'exception qui vole sur un avion d'exception. Je parle évidemment de la Patrouille Tranchant.
On a 279
And speaking of real treats, performing now at sunset, the exceptional Rafale solo display. Four-point roll is a manoeuvre that we see quite a lot, and let's be honest, it's not very interesting. Here is a 4-point roll, but with a difference. the direction of roll alternating at each 90-degree hesitation is just on a different level to every other fast-jet solo on the circuit in terms of the imagination that has gone into designing every single manoeuvre in this sequence. Sadly, we're not seeing this year's special scheme Rafale C, which unfortunately encountered technical problems while waiting on the runway before its show. Rather, a standard grey Raphael B two-seater. The Rafale in regular service is limited to 9G. It was previously the case that the aircraft used for flying displays were limited to 11G instead. Sadly, that has now changed, much to the dismay of the display pilot. But from a spectator's point of view, there's actually very little difference. Now the aircraft approaches on the left 45-degree line for a pop-up attack. An incredible rate of turn, holding that inverted on-crowd trajectory and then pulling very abruptly onto the display line. A demonstration too of the Rafale's exceptional roll rate. It's limited to 270 degrees per second by the flight control software, which is the highest roll rate of any 4th or 5th generation fighter. By my rough calculations, the highest roll rate we see demonstrated in this performance is 265 degrees per second, so right up on that limit, and by far the fastest that we've seen from any comparable fighter. And a very dramatic slow pass, flown directly towards the spectators, which only enhances the effect of that aircraft hanging almost static in mid-air. Yet still having enough power at its disposal to accelerate into a loop. 2 Snecma M88s producing 34,000 pounds of thrust. That is all from Air Legend 2023, and what a show it was. We've got 2 more episodes of Airshow Dispatches to come this year, both from the USA, but that is dependent on the US government agreeing to fund itself, so fingers crossed, eh? I hope to see you soon from Fleet Week in San Francisco, but from me, Adam Landau, it's goodbye for now.